Welcome to your Chapter 11 lecture video. This chapter is on the endocrine system, which is the body system that controls and regulates all of the body's hormones. So we're going to be looking at multiple different organs that comprise this system. The endocrine system works with your nervous system to help in regulation, so it helps to maintain our homeostasis. And so we're going to start off by looking at some different ways that it does that. So as I said, the endocrine system is working to help maintain homeostasis, that natural balance in our body. But remember, this is always in flux. Not the level of homeostasis, right? You have kind of your base level, but the body is always kind of working to get to that point. It rarely stays in perfect homeostasis. It's usually kind of fluctuating just around it. So the endocrine system is compromised with cells, tissues, organs, all called endocrine glands, and they're secreting hormones into the body fluids. And that's what makes it an endocrine gland, is that it's actually secreting into the bloodstream or into the lymph system or whatever body fluid it might be, versus exocrine glands, which are, as we see down here, the exocrine glands, which have ducts. So hormones typically are being released into the bloodstream, and they act on a target cell that is some distance away. So something in your brain is being released that's going to be working on your liver. Some glands don't release into necessarily the full bloodstream, but they do release into like the interstitial fluid. So not really true hormones, but we call them local hormones. There are two types, the paracrine and autocrine hormones. So these are both, again, types of local hormones, meaning that they just act right around that cell that they were released from, basically. Paracrine secretions, they're going to affect neighboring cells, so this could be like a warning signal. Maybe a cell gets infected, and so it releases a certain hormone that then tells its neighbors, hey, I'm infected, go ahead and be careful. So that would be a paracrine secretion, or autocrine secretions, which only affect the cell that secreted it. So again, that same infected cell might release a hormone that helps to actually start to break itself down and start to inhibit its ability to synthesize proteins. And so that would be an autocrine secretion where a cell is acting upon itself. And once more, exocrine releasing it into ducts going outside of the body, so things like the mouth, the reproductive tract, and endocrine glands actually releasing into body fluids, the interstitial fluid, the blood, to affect those target cells. That's a phrase we'll kind of come back to. Here's just a little graphic of the different major endocrine glands. And note that it says major endocrine glands. A lot of organs have cells that are also containing an endocrine response, or endocrine uh, function. Things like the hypothalamus, pituitary, and pineal glands in your brain, thyroid and parathyroid glands, right, just kind of at the base of the throat, the thymus kind of sitting on the heart, adrenal glands on top of the kidney and the pancreas as well, and ovaries and testicles, the reproductive organs. So let's look at the major ones again, just kind of listing them out. So read through these, make sure you understand kind of the main organs of this system. And then, as we said, the specialized cells that you'll see in other body parts, liver, heart, GI tract. So nervous and endocrine systems are both working to regulate homeostasis and keep the body in balance. They do it in different ways. The nervous system uses neurotransmitters, whereas the endocrine system uses hormones. Both of them still work on target cells. So there is still this idea that they're activating specific cells, but they do it much differently. The nervous system is a lot faster. The endocrine system, having to release and diffuse through the blood, is going to be slower. The endocrine system has a larger effect, though, because while it is going after target cells and it does work at a cellular level, it can affect kind of the whole body. Think about when you take ibuprofen or Tylenol, some kind of general pain reliever or whatever it may be. Sure, you might be taking it because your knee hurts and it helps, right? You take some ibuprofen if your knee is hurting and it helps. But it's not necessarily specifically targeting the knee. That pill of ibuprofen does not know to go directly to your knee. It's going to go to your whole body. It's going to help all the aches, all the pains, anything that's going on, just generally, because that's how hormones work, is that they travel through the bloodstream, they exit at random points, and then if there's a cell there that they can affect, they do. Nervous system, again, is going to be much more specific in its response. It still has a target cell, but it's not like you're just releasing a broad nervous signal that's going to randomly affect different parts of the body. And endocrine system usually lasts longer. That's something else to remember. Nervous system tends to be an on-off, whereas the endocrine system, you have this kind of delayed response, and so it tends to be a lot more in flux. Endocrine glands also are going to really affect a lot of metabolic processes within cells that then magnifies up into the whole body. And so we'll see how different types of hormones do that. A little bit more about paracrine and autocrine secretions, these local hormones. So paracrine, again, it's substances released into the interstitial fluid. They really quickly break down, so they don't have time to go to the bloodstream. They only act on nearby cells. An example of that would be histamine that's released from white blood cells, and it causes increased blood flow to an area, which helps to bring in fresh nutrients and more white blood cells. Autocrine secretions, this would be cells only acting on the cells that secrete them, substances by the liver that cause them to release iron, things like that. Autocrine secretions can also help to regulate, as we said, the life cycle of a cell. This is just a chart comparing the two different types, nervous versus endocrine. So make sure you're comfortable with this, read through that. And here's a graphic just kind of showing how there is this similarity between them, where you have the origin of the signal, how it travels, either impulse or through the bloodstream, and then the target cell effect. So there are two different types of hormones, generally speaking, two broad categories: your steroid and non-steroidal hormones. Steroids are derived from cholesterol. This is stuff like your androgens, estrogen, and testosterone, things like that, cortisol. Non-steroids, those are going to be a much more broad range of hormones that we're going to look at. Here's a couple of examples, again, just kind of going through this chart. The steroids at the top, like I said, estrogen, testosterone. And then you have other ones, your non-steroidals, amines, peptides, polypeptides, and glycoproteins. This is, again, a much more vast array of hormones. Some of these you've heard of, probably epinephrine and norepinephrine, maybe thyroid hormone, growth hormone, things like that. We're going to go through all of these plus some more. So you will need to be familiar with the hormone names, where they're released from, and their actions. So let's start with the steroid hormones. So the big thing about steroid hormones is that they are lipid soluble. So that means that they are fat soluble hormones. They are hydrophobic. But to get to places, they have to travel through the bloodstream, which is mostly water. That plasma is mostly water. And so steroid hormones are bound to these plasma proteins, plasma, right? Blood plasma, bound to these plasma proteins. So that kind of helps to protect them. It kind of wraps them in a little bit of protection so that as they travel through the bloodstream, they're still able to stay safe, so they can actually make it to their target cells versus paracrine hormones, right? That are going to break down really quickly. And so as the lipid-soluble hormone is traveling through the bloodstream, it's wrapped in this little plasma protein. It finally gets to the spot where it wants to exit. So it, again, this is a weak bind. And so it can then bond. That's what I was like, bond? What's the word? It's a weak bond between the hormone and protein. And so it can easily detach and then diffuse into the cell that it needs to affect. So those target hormones have receptors on the target cell that are going to help it to bind. The hormone and the target cell both have receptors that are going to be able to help them identify themselves and where they need to latch onto. And because this is a lipid-soluble hormone, and if you think about the phospholipid plasma membrane, right, the outside of the plasma membrane is hydrophobic. It's got those lipid heads. Well, like can dissolve into like. So this lipid hormone can diffuse through the lipid head, and then it's just got a small little, hydrophilic internal bilayer, and so that's just a quick little thing that it can diffuse across. So that short of space isn't enough to degrade the lipid hormone, so it kind of very quickly moves from the outside through the middle into the internal environment of the cell, and that's when it can actually produce its effect. So lipid-soluble hormones, something, kind of basics things you need to remember. Lipid-soluble, they're going to have a carrier protein. That's these plasma proteins. They're going to diffuse into the cell, and they're going to initiate protein synthesis. So we're talking about steroid hormones, estrogen, testosterone. Think about puberty. When you go into puberty, it's a big period of growth. A lot of that is going to be proteins, larger bones, larger muscles, deeper vocal cords, more body hair, right? All of that requires proteins. And so steroids, going to be protein synthesis is a lot of what they're going to cover. Not fully, but we'll see there's a lot of different ones. But that's just kind of a very kind of general way that you can remember that lipid soluble, diffuse into the cell, and initiate protein synthesis. What's actually happening is that lipid soluble hormone is going to diffuse into the nucleus, and it's going to bind to what's called a hormone receptor complex. It's going to create a hormone receptor complex. That then binds to your DNA and activates certain genes, specific genes for proteins. That then may be an enzyme, a transport protein, a hormone receptor, whatever it may be. Depending on that specific steroid hormone, that specific steroid hormone's effect on that target cell, it will determine what kind of protein it's going to be. So you'll have the same steroid hormone, right? It's always estrogen or testosterone or whatever it may be, but depending on what cell it's binding to, it might have a different effect. So a cell that's in your liver, it might be functioning as enzyme transport, and a cell that's in your skin, it could be a hair protein that it's trying to synthesize. Still the same hormone, but different effects depending on the target cell's location. Here's a depiction of that, so you can follow 1 through 5. You start with the hormone molecule, this lipid-soluble hormone diffusing through the plasma membrane. It then goes into the nucleus where it binds to this protein receptor and forms the hormone receptor complex. The HRC is what we abbreviate it. That then binds to the DNA molecule and synthesizes a specific strand of mRNA that then goes through the normal synthesis process. It makes this new protein molecule. So non-steroidal hormones, non-steroid hormones. So these are your water-soluble hormones. So they do not require carrier proteins. They can float easily through the bloodstream without being degraded. But they cannot enter the cell. They can't enter the plasma membrane. So they have to stay on the outside, and they have to kind of work through different other receptors to create their response. And just like with steroid hormones, the response was protein synthesis. And non-steroidal hormones, it's going to be some type of cellular metabolic process. It's going to increase or decrease some kind of cell process through a slightly different way. So let's look at this. So since those water-soluble hormones can't go into the phospholipid bilayer, they are going to bind to receptors on the outside of the cell. So non-steroid hormones combined with receptors in target cell membranes, those things have a binding site and an active site. So your hormone is going to be the first messenger, and then the receptor that it binds to is called the second messenger. That then causes this cascade of biological activity, and we call it signal transduction. So that's something very, very kind of you'll hear kind of cliche when we talk about non-steroidal hormones is the cascade and the signal transduction, because these are going to amplify signals. They're going to be amplifying some type of process within the cell, either a process to turn on or a process to turn off. It can be either way. Again, depends on the hormone binding to which target cell. The hormone complex activates a G protein. This is just a specific type of protein within cells. It only has a single letter as a name. That's just weird, but that's just how it is. So it could be an A protein, it could be an H protein, but specifically for non-steroidal hormones, it's going to be activating a G protein. That then activates another enzyme called adenylate cyclase. So you can see how when they talk about the cascade, this is what they're talking about. Your hormone is the first messenger, then you have receptors for second messengers, a G protein, another enzyme. That enzyme is going to break down ATP to cyclic AMP, and then that activates another thing. So it's this kind of, again, cascade of falling down. It all starts with the hormone. And the hormone, as it goes in here and activates, these enzymes, it's going to activate multiple enzyme molecules, which then are going to break down even more ATP molecules. So you can start with one hormone, but it could have an effect on 100 or 1,000 molecules. So that's why that amplification is coming from. So again, eventually with non-steroidal hormones, the goal is to activate adenylate cyclase so that ATP, your adenosine triphosphate, your energy molecule, can be converted into this cyclic form, this cyclic AMP, adenosine monophosphate. This molecule activates an enzyme called protein kinase. And protein kinases, anytime you see kinase, this means that it's going to add a phosphate to something. And what do you know? You have ATP to cyclic AMP. Well, now there's two free phosphates that are just kind of floating around, and you have this enzyme that's trying to add phosphates to things. So we call it phosphorylation, and phosphorylation can turn on or off cell activities. Again, it just depends on the cell. Thankfully, you don't have to learn how each hormone affects each body cell. You just have to understand this general process, that non-steroidal water-soluble hormones, they act as the first messenger. I think this next one, yeah, here we go. This non-steroidal molecule is your first messenger. It binds to this receptor molecule that activates a G protein. There's your second messenger. And then that activates the adenylate cyclase enzyme, which is going to convert ATP into cyclic AMP. And then cyclic AMP can activate these protein kinases that are going to activate your proteins. Okay, let's look at some others. Prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are a type of kind of local hormone. So they're produced from the actual plasma membrane. They're produced from the lipids and the fatty acids from the plasma membrane. A lot of organs are going to produce prostaglandins. They are, again, potent in small amounts, so it does not take a lot of them, but they're a really great way for the organ to be able to affect itself. Because sometimes, waiting for nervous system or endocrine system to kind of do that regulation, it's just easier to take care of yourself at a certain point. And so these things are not stored. They're produced when they're needed, and after they exert their effects, they are then degraded. So again, really kind of quick effects that they have. They have a wide range of actions as well. Prostaglandins can do a ton of different things. Some are going to relax smooth muscle while others contract it. Some stimulate secretion of other hormones, influence blood pressure, reproductive physiology. We'll see that prostaglandins are crucial during labor and delivery, and so they are crucial in being able to cause the uterus to contract and expel the fetus. So let's look at thinking about control of hormonal secretions. That was kind of a good overview about all the different types of kind of categories and effects of hormones. But how are those things then controlled? Because they do need to be precisely regulated. Like we said, with prostaglandins or with the larger hormones, they can really have effects when they get out of whack. Usually it's through negative feedback. So negative feedback control mechanisms. Essentially, negative feedback is always trying to return to homeostasis. That's what you have to remember about negative feedback, is that it's always moving back to homeostasis. It's always trying to go back to that mid-level. So as one hormone starts to maybe, if you think about it, you release a lot of a hormone for some type of action. You're releasing testosterone to respond to protein growth, what's a good kind of quick example? Blood sugar. The blood sugar's regulation is always much easier. So your body, you eat a nice good meal, and then your body starts to break down all that blood glucose, and your glucose starts to rise. Well, as your glucose level rises above homeostasis, your body releases insulin, and insulin starts to break your glucose back down in your bloodstream so that it comes back towards the normal level. But because insulin only knows to break glucose down, it's just going to keep breaking it down, and eventually it's going to go below your normal blood glucose level. Once it starts to drop below the normal blood glucose level, your pancreatic cells get those signals that, hey, no, it's too low. You need to stop breaking it down. And so the pancreas will stop releasing insulin based off of that negative feedback, that response of, oh no, now the levels are too low. We need to slow down the breakdown of glucose. And so this negative feedback is always trying to move back to homeostasis. Here you can see different examples of that. The hypothalamus is a big control center of the endocrine system. And so the hypothalamus releases hormones that affect the anterior pituitary gland. That then will send it to some other peripheral gland. So you could think about the hypothalamus telling the anterior pituitary to activate the thyroid gland. The anterior pituitary then tells the thyroid gland, okay, yes, let's, release more thyroid hormone. Well, as more thyroid hormone is released, that's then going to inhibit both of these glands from secreting their substances as well. And so once that happens, then what do you know? The thyroid gland hormone might start getting a little low. Once that hormone level starts to get low, this inhibiting signal starts to get weaker. And so then these two start releasing their hormones again. And so it's kind of this, again, always in flux. The nervous system, it's going to be trying to produce some specific action. As that action occurs, it's then going to inhibit it in the nervous system so it's not overdone. Changing level of substance in plasma. This could, again, be blood glucose, could be blood oxygen, anything like that, calcium, whatever it may be. As the hormone is then changing, as that changing level influences the endocrine gland, and those target cells then, again, secrete more calcium or absorb more calcium, whatever it may be. That action is going to influence the levels of plasma, levels of substances in the plasma, and that will then inhibit its release. So that way things don't drop too low or raise too high. Commonly, it is negative feedback that controls hormone release, but there is some positive feedback mechanisms that will look, mostly labor. just heads up. In negative feedback system, a gland is sensitive to the concentration of the substance that it's regulating. Wait, did I? Okay, no, I thought I went the wrong way for a second. As hormone levels rise, the hormone exerts its effect. Further secretion is inhibited by negative feedback, and the hormone secretion decreases. Um, Again, this is just kind of what I was saying on these last couple of pages. So read through this if you need to kind of see it written down for you. Here is a nice little graph that summarizes this. So this is, time versus increasing concentration of hormone. So this is the reality, is that, this actual concentration of hormone, this wavy line, this is what actually happens, is that, the endocrine glands are kind of in flux of releasing more and then releasing less. But it averages out to this midline. Because while insulin is going to be increasing, as insulin increases, you break down more glucose. Well, there's a hormone called glucagon that decreases. I'm sorry, that is going to increase blood glucose levels. And so, in reality, what's happening is that you have multiple hormones that are releasing at the same time. So while insulin might be going up and down like this, glucagon will be going at the opposite rate of it, and combined, they give you this nice homeostatic level. Okay, so now we're going to get into some specific glands, their hormones, and actions. I'm going to be uploading a chart into the lab folder on Blackboard that just kind of helps you to organize hormones and gives you some good questions to ask and a good chart to fill out. We'll try to do that in lab. So starting with the pituitary gland, this is sitting in the brain. And the pituitary gland has a big regulatory function. It's attached to the hypothalamus by this thing called the infundibulum. And while the hypothalamus is the main regulator for the endocrine system, the pituitary gland is its general, you can kind of say. I don't really know how military structure works, so that might not make sense. But the pituitary gland is doing a lot of heavy lifting. So it has an anterior and posterior lobe. The anterior lobe is your endocrine tissue, essentially. It's making hormones and releasing them, while the posterior lobe, the posterior pituitary, is actually part of the nervous system. It has nervous structures, and it does store two hormones, but those hormones are made from the hypothalamus, and they're stored in the posterior pituitary and released from there. Here you can see that sagittal section of the brain, the pituitary gland sitting right there below the hypothalamus. These are just cerebral aqueducts. All right, so the hypothalamus again controls the activity of the anterior both the anterior and posterior, but it does it differently because the anterior is connected to it through an actual blood vessel pathway, while the posterior is connected through a neural pathway. So in the anterior pituitary gland, the hypothalamus actually secretes releasing and inhibiting hormones. So it has a whole list of releasing and inhibiting hormones that then are acting on the anterior pituitary. A lot of times it's something like thyroid hormone inhibiting hormone that will come from the hypothalamus, and THIH, thyroid hormone inhibiting hormone, will then inhibit the release of thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, which then inhibits the production of thyroid hormone from the thyroid. So it's this kind of cascade down. Those are carried along those portal veins, those hypophyseal portal veins that connect the anterior and pituitary with the hypothalamus. And again, it's going to it's going to tell those anterior pituitary cells to either stimulate to release or stop releasing their hormone. The posterior pituitary, it's mostly nerve signals that are then going to tell it to release or stop releasing those hormones that the hypothalamus produces, but the posterior pituitary stores into the blood. Here you can see the hypophyseal portal system versus this neural track, the hypothalamic neurons carrying signals to the posterior pituitary, and then from the posterior pituitary, it can actually be released through the bloodstream. So some anterior pituitary hormones. This is going to be the gland with the most number of hormones that we're going to have to learn. So anterior pituitary, first one, growth hormone. It does exactly what it sounds like. It stimulates body cells to grow and reproduce. It gets really active around puberty until about 35-ish, and then starts to really drop off at a very depressing rate. It's going to determine how fast cells should use carbs and fats for growth and reproduction, how much energy should be put into those processes as well. From the hypothalamus, growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone help to balance the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. So GHRH and GHIH then stimulate or reduce the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. And growth hormone itself is then going to go and target other body cells and body organs and have them produce even more. So it affects almost all cells in the body are affected by growth hormone and have, well, what we say by that, how we say that is all cells in the body have receptors for growth hormone. Nutritional status affects release of growth hormone, age, time of day, certain health factors. They're all going to affect that release as well. Some imbalances, things like pituitary dwarfism due to insufficient growth hormone, gigantism due to oversecretion, and acromegaly is when it happens in adulthood. So normally once you kind of get to a certain point, in growth, you stop growing. But sometimes people keep growing, and it's this oversecretion of growth hormone. Prolactin is another hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. So prolactin, lactin, lactate, this is milk. So this one actually promotes milk production during pregnancy, after pregnancy, sometimes just, if it gets released. And so you have PRF, prolactin releasing, and PIH, prolactin inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus that are then going to determine the amounts of prolactin being released. Important to note that prolactin just makes the milk. It does not cause the milk to be released. That's another hormone that we're going to look at later in just a few slides. Okay, so this is another one I was mentioning earlier, thyroid stimulating hormone, so TSH. So the anterior pituitary releases TSH, and that then can tell the thyroid to release more thyroid hormone. The amount of TSH comes from TRH, thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, stimulates the release of TSH. As you start to have an increase in the blood concentration of thyroid hormones, it's going to negatively feedback on TRH and TSH. Here's a good picture of that. So the hypothalamus up here releasing TRH, you can see that's green and positive on the thyroid anterior pituitary, which then releases TSH that goes into the bloodstream and then stimulates thyroid hormone production from the thyroid gland. As thyroid hormones enter the bloodstream, their concentrations are registered by both the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, and it's inhibiting their release, their actions. And the thyroid hormone, we'll see in a minute, it affects a lot of different metabolic functions of the body. Okay, continuing, anterior pituitary. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's a big, big word. Let's break it down. Adrenocorticotropic. Adreno stands for adrenal glands. So those are the glands that sit on top of your kidney. Cortico refers to the actual cortex, so it's referring to a specific region of the adrenal gland. And tropic usually means causing the release of something. Anytime you talk about tropic hormones, it's usually causing an increased production or increased release of something. So adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, is an anterior pituitary hormone that is going to be affecting the release of hormones from the adrenal cortex. It is, of course, regulated by corticotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, as well as stress. Stress can cause an increased release of corticotropin-releasing hormone, and that has cascades. So you can see we're not actually getting into the effect of these hormones. So we actually have to get to the adrenal gland before we can talk about what these hormones are going to do, but ACTH just increases their effect. Gonadotropins, so gonads, these are the sexual organs. And there's that word trope again. So these are increasing the release of gonadotropins. FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland, affect the gonads, the testes in the male, ovaries in the female. You also see, it's just noting, this is kind of for, once we get to the reproductive chapter, LH is also interstitial cell stimulating hormone. Follicles, so we'll see follicles, these refer to both sperm and egg cell production. Just heads up, yeah, these two are both involved with things like ovulation, sperm and egg cell production, regulating the uterine lining during menstruation, that kind of stuff. All right, now let's look at the two posterior pituitary hormones. So the posterior pituitary, as we said, does not make these hormones. The hypothalamus makes them. Antidiuretic. One second. Antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. The posterior pituitary stores those. The hypothalamus sends nervous signals to the posterior pituitary to have them released into the bloodstream, and then they go and have their effects. They are still called posterior pituitary hormones because they're released and stored there. ADH, I'm sorry, I kept saying 2, but it definitely is 3. ADH, your antidiuretic hormone. Wait, did I? No, okay, yeah, it was just 2. Ooh. Friday afternoon. I'm recording this on a Friday afternoon and I'm learning my lesson. So ADH, antidiuretic. A diuretic is something that causes you to urinate and lose water. Tea, coffee, caffeine, any of those kind of substances cause you to actually urinate more and lose more water. So antidiuretic is inhibiting the loss of water. It causes the kidneys to conserve water, reduces the amount of water excreted in the urine, so you have a more concentrated urine. Hypothalamus, of course, is going to regulate that secretion based on the amount of water in body fluids. Osmoreceptors are going to detect those changes, osmo for water, and then send signals up to the brain to let them know how much ADH needs to be secreted. As water levels start to drop in the body, ADH will then cause the conservation of more water. If it's really, really low blood volume, let's say you're sweating a lot, you're really working hard on summer day or something, and you're not replenishing water properly, then your blood pressure will start to fall, and so your body can release really high levels of ADH. It's also called vasopressin. You'll see this a lot of times. Also called vasopressin, by the way. It'll release a lot of this hormone, and it actually causes vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. It'll actually cause them to constrict to help maintain blood pressure. There are 2 types of diabetes that we're going to look at. Diabetes insipidus. This one is from insufficient ADH. This one has to do with water balance, losing too much water through your kidneys. Diabetes mellitus is what is the blood sugar one. So insipidus, they're both called diabetes, but insipidus refers to water volume, where mellitus is the sugar. Looking at oxytocin, oxytocin is helping with childbirth, as I kind of talked about earlier. Helping prostaglandins are necessary for childbirth, but so is oxytocin. Helps to contract those uterine muscles, and in milk ejection. So prolactin causes milk production, and oxytocin causes the actual milk release. We call it the letdown. The milk letdown. After stimulating by breastfeeding, things like an infant suckling, or certain environmental cues can do it too. The stretching of the uterine and vaginal tissues, that's what stimulates the release of oxytocin and prostaglandins to then release more. So these are some of the few things that actually go through positive feedback. The act, meaning that the action that's happening, the suckling of the infant, the stretching of the uterine wall, it causes the release of oxytocin. But of course, once an infant is nursing and they start to actually get some milk, that's just going to cause them to suckle even harder, or suckle even more. And so then that's going to cause the body to release more oxytocin, which causes more milk release. And so it's actually through positive feedback. Same thing with labor. As oxytocin is released, that's going to cause that contraction of the uterine tissue. So that is going to expel the fetus further, but as the fetus is moving through the birth canal, it causes more stretch of those reproductive tissues, which causes more oxytocin, which causes more contractions. So it's that positive feedback. So while negative feedback is always working towards homeostasis, trying to return to a base level, positive feedback, we say, is working to a climatic event. Positive feedback is trying to push higher, 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 more to cause something to happen. And hopefully you can understand through childbirth and breastfeeding, something is happening. These hormones are being released in higher amounts to be able to cause that action. There is a chart for your anterior the hormones of the pituitary gland, anterior and posterior lobe on the next page. So make sure you read through that. You are familiar with these hormones, their actions, and their source. Okay, now getting into another gland. I told you anterior pituitary was had the most hormones by far. Thyroid gland has a couple. So the thyroid gland, this is the one that kind of sits in the throat, right on top of the larynx. I'm sorry, just below the larynx. It has this thing that connects it called the isthmus. Connects the 2 lobes of the thyroid gland. Thyroid hormone is going to help control caloric intake, so your metabolic processes in the body, and then help to regulate blood calcium as well. The thyroid has these units called follicles, and each follicle is filled with colloid. And colloid is just a really high protein fluid. But that protein is going to be the hormone. Follicle cells are what secrete the hormone that's been stored in that follicle. Um, they secrete the hormones and then they're either stored in the colloid or they release it into the blood. That's what I meant to say. So here you can see the thyroid sitting right on top or just below the larynx. I keep wanting to say on top of the trachea, but below the larynx. Here is the follicle cells. So these little cells all surrounding it are your follicular cells. And then the middle is this fluid-filled sac, this colloid. And so this is what has the actual hormone in it. So there are 3 hormones that are released from the thyroid gland, but 2 of those are essentially the same hormone. It's this T3 and T4. T3 and T4 are thyroid hormone. When you hear someone talk about thyroid hormone, TH, they're talking about these 2 hormones. And even though they are slightly different, this just kind of it's based on thankfully, you don't have to learn the actual mechanism and pathways for producing these 2 hormones, but it does just kind of involve this random either adding of an extra iodine for T4 or one less for T3. And this is this is triiodothyronine, so tri-3, so this should clearly be T3, where tetra should be T4. So don't just note that. But really, in reality, your follicular cells are going to make both T4 and T3, but it's almost all converted to T3 once it gets to the cells. That extra iodine is just kind of thrown off. And so it's just because it's more potent, it has a lot better activity level at the target cells. They have same actions, regulating metabolism of carbs, lipids, and proteins. They increase the rate at which cells release energy from carbs, enhance protein synthesis, and stimulate the breakdown and mobilization of lipids and movement, right, and storage of lipids. Thyroid hormone is the major factor in determining your BMR, your basal metabolic rate. This is the minimum caloric intake necessary to maintain life, to maintain your basic metabolic functions of your body. If you're only meeting your BMR, then you really aren't giving yourself enough for any kind of growth and repair necessarily. You're just kind of maintaining basic functions. T3, T4 thyroid hormone are essential for normal growth and development. The hypothalamus and pituitary glands, as we've seen before, TRH and TSH control the release of thyroid hormone. And iodine is needed by the follicular cell. So this is why we always have iodized salt. And if you only eat, let's just go ahead and say Americans do not have a problem getting the amount of iodized salt that they need, because even if we don't, unless you are truly eating 100% of your meals from your house, you're making every single sauce and dip and everything yourself, and you're only using kosher salt or like natural sea salt, that is not iodized. Table salt that we normally use is iodized. And so if you're eating out, or again, aren't making every single ingredient and ketchup and condiment, all of that stuff has salt in it, and it's all iodized salt. That's why we don't have goiter nearly anywhere near the levels that developing countries will, because in other countries, if they don't have access to iodized salt, the body can't actually release the thyroid hormone, and so it gets stored in those colloid pockets. But for us, because we iodize our salt, and most countries iodize their salt, it actually reduces that risk of goiter, which is that swelling that you see on the front of the throat. So thyroid hormone, it's going to really affect body metabolism, how fast you break down food, and what your body does with it. The other hormone is calcitonin. So calcitonin is going to lower blood levels of calcium and phosphate when they get to be too high. So it actually increases bone calcium deposition in bone. It increases your bone density by deactivating osteoclasts, and it increases bone density, and it causes the release of calcium and phosphate from the kidneys into the urine. So when your blood calcium gets high, it's going to lower it back down. It's regulated by the levels of calcium. So when the calcium levels get high, calcitonin gets secreted, and then as those levels start to drop through negative feedback, it's inhibited. So some thyroid disorders, this might help you to kind of, because again, you probably have heard people talk about thyroid or maybe thyroid conditions. It's not uncommon for people to have thyroid conditions. Hypo and hyperthyroidism. Hypothyroidism, so not enough thyroid, can cause low metabolic rate, fatigue, and weight gain in adults. Uh, I worked with somebody who, over the course of maybe a year and a half or 2 years or so, he gained about 100, 150 pounds. Couldn't figure out why. He was really tired, really exhausted. Finally went to the doctor because, he just thought that it was stress and not eating enough or eating too much and not working out. Kind of just, as you get into your 20s and late 20s and things, you're like, oh, it's just my body's changing like this. No, he had a tumor on his thyroid. he had hypothyroidism and from a tumor. So as soon as he got rid of the tumor, within 6 months, he had dropped all of that weight and was back to his normal energy level and everything. So it's always something to be thinking about. Not always thinking about. I don't want to make anybody paranoid. But any kind of rapid, uh, large changes in your health, you should go see a provider for that. In infants, it can cause cretinism, poor bone and growth formation, abnormal mental development, sluggishness. And then hyperthyroidism, high metabolic rate, causes overeating because you can't get enough calories. You can't hold on to weight. It just your body is breaking down carbohydrates and fats so quickly that it actually can't be used. It's just getting rid of it. And sometimes a kind of classic symptom of it is this exophthalmia, this eye protrusion. And I was just talking about earlier goiter, enlarged thyroid that appears as a bulge in the neck because of, depending on the disease, right? It can cause either hypo or hyperthyroidism. You can still get goiter. Okay, this is just that chart for your thyroid hormone. All right, looking at the parathyroid now. So the thyroid is the main larger organ on the front of the throat. The parathyroid glands sit on the back of the thyroid gland. This says 4 tiny parathyroids, so kind of 2 on the left, 2 on the right, but it can be up to 6 on each side. So you can have a lot of these. It doesn't mean that you're releasing more parathyroid hormone, PTH. It just means that you just have more cells of those glands. So it's not a medical condition or anything. These are just little, small, tightly packed secretory cells. And parathyroid hormone is going to be the counter to calcitonin. So it increases blood calcium and decreases the phosphate ion. So PTH is going to cause your bones to break down, essentially. So it's stimulating bone resorption, that osteoclastic activity, to release calcium into the bloodstream. And it stimulates the kidneys to conserve calcium. It also acts on the kidneys to activate vitamin D, which is going to increase absorption of calcium in the intestines. And then, of course, it's negative feedback mechanism, so that as your blood calcium levels get back to a high enough level, it can then be inhibited, so that way you don't get too high of blood calcium. So here they are, those little pink things just kind of sitting on the back of the thyroid gland. And here is kind of an example of their activity. So the parathyroid releasing parathyroid hormone into the bloodstream. It's going to act on the bones and the kidneys. The bones to release calcium, the kidneys to conserve calcium, 1, so there's just more calcium available in the bloodstream. And then 2, activate vitamin D, which allows for absorption of calcium through the intestines. So it's kind of increasing it in 3 different ways. As, again, those increase, then it's inhibited by the calcium levels in the blood. So this is just comparing the 2 of those. So calcitonin and PTH are working together to maintain proper blood calcium concentration through opposite effects. So there's usually a little bit of each being released by the body, depending on, because, it would be nice to think that, yes, your blood has completely 100% equal distribution of ions all throughout it, but it doesn't. So some cells are going to recognize slightly higher levels of calcium, while some might recognize slightly lower. It's going to send these competing signals, and the body has to kind of decide which one to follow. And so there's always going to be a little calcitonin and a little PTH being released to kind of find a balanced effect. Hypoparathyroidism and hyperparathyroidism are exactly what they sound like. All right, let's get into the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are the ones that sit right on top of the kidneys, and they have a unique structure. Well, not really a unique structure, but their structure does kind of regulate how they're working and functioning here. They have this inner medulla, so medulla in the middle, and then the outer cortex. The medulla is in the middle there. It's what's releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. It has this sympathetic nervous system kind of connection, and so it can release those stress hormones. The cortex, which is on the outside, it actually has three layers, and each zone is going to release a different kind of hormone. So you have the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and then the zona reticularis, most internal. GFR, that's just kind of a little phrase you can remember. Glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis. Once we get into the kidneys, we'll talk about GFR some more in a slightly different way, but it's one of those things that GFR just always sticks in my brain, and it's how I remember the levels of the adrenal cortex. So here you can see the adrenal gland sitting right on top of the kidney, this outer cortical layer, and this inner medulla. And then you see the medulla is just this thinner layer here, and then you have these three zones of the cortex: glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. So looking at the adrenal medulla, that internal portion first, as I said, it releases epinephrine and norepinephrine into your bloodstream. They have really similar structure, really similar function. So they kind of, it's like with T3 and T4. They're pretty much going to be doing the same thing. There's some specifics when you're looking at like very specific types of neurons, but for the most part, they're doing the same thing. They're causing the body to be able to prepare for fight or flight, for a stress response. So they do some, again, have this connection to the sympathetic neurotransmitter, but when they're released as a hormone, it's 10 times longer effect. So the sympathetic neurotransmitter, again, nervous system is going to be much more local, much shorter effect, whereas the endocrine system just has this magnified impact because it's going through the bloodstream. The basic effects of epinephrine, norepinephrine, things like increasing heart rate, blood pressure, blood glucose for energy, dilating airways to get more air in and carbon dioxide out, decreasing digestive activities. It's moving all of that blood from the GI tract into your muscles so that way you can run faster and lift heavier things. So just again, thinking about, all right, epinephrine, norepinephrine, fight or flight, what do you need if you are going to be running from something or having to fight something? The medullary hormones, regulation by nerve impulses from the central nervous system through the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So that's usually how it's regulated. This is just comparing epinephrine to norepinephrine. Again, it's going to have really, really similar effects, maybe some slight differences, but still overall pretty much the same thing. All right, getting into the cortex. So there's three layers to the cortex. It produces over 30 steroids, some that are much more vital to survival than others. The most important are aldosterone, cortisol, and the sex hormones. So aldosterone, it's a mineralocorticoid. Mineralocorticoid. Mineralo referring to the mineral and electrolyte balance. So it's going to be really working with things like calcium, potassium, sodium, to try and make sure that everything is being regulated properly. Causes the kidneys to conserve sodium and to excrete potassium. And it's secreted in response to decreasing blood volume and blood pressure. So as your blood volume, as your blood pressure starts to drop, let's say you've got a bad wound and you're bleeding out, your adrenal gland will release aldosterone, and then aldosterone will tell your kidneys and it will start to conserve water and cause some vasoconstriction. Cortisol is one of your main stress hormones. So just like epinephrine and norepinephrine, we'll see that they kind of are the quick stress hormones, whereas cortisol is for longer regulation of stress responses. It is a glucocorticoid, not a mineralocorticoid. So glucocorticoid, meaning that it regulates glucose metabolism, mostly by inhibiting it. So it causes glucose to be stored as fat rather than used up. Cortisol mostly is going to inhibit protein synthesis to increase blood amino acids, promotes fatty acid release from adipose tissue, increasing use of fatty acids and decreasing the use of glucose. And it causes liver cells to produce glucose from non-carbs to increase blood glucose. So when you have really high levels of cortisol, even if you are eating properly, you can still be losing weight because you're not making proteins and it's releasing all this fatty acid tissue, and really you're just going to be urinating out or releasing out the blood glucose from other sources. So it's kind of a common classic sign of stress when you're having trouble with weight fluctuations because your body's going back and forth from releasing fatty acids to using glucose to not, and so it can get kind of hectic. And this idea of producing glucose from non-carbohydrates, so using your body's proteins, breaking down your muscles, breaking down body structures to make glucose rather than just using the glucose that you're taking in. Negative feedback involving CRH from the hypothalamus, cortico-releasing hormone, again is going to act on that adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary to help control the release of cortisol. But stress, injury, and disease can trigger increased release of cortisol. So multiple factors that can go into play here. And we'll look at more of the stress response in a moment. So this is just showing that negative feedback and cortisol secretion from the higher brain centers. So this could be, again, like your conscious brain. So your body actually recognizing, oh, or maybe you don't recognize you're stressed, but that perception of stress or that increased stress on certain higher brain centers then causes these autonomic regions, the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, to increase their release of their hormones that then stimulates the release of cortisol. As cortisol levels increase, it's still a negative feedback on these other structures. However, if you are still stressed and you're not regulating your actual stress responses, then your higher brain centers can override this negative feedback and cause even more cortisol to be released. So even though cortisol levels are increasing, if your stress levels are getting out of control and unmanageable, then you're still just going to be releasing more cortisol. And then as you see, it inhibits protein synthesis, promotes fatty acid release, that breakdown of excess fat, which, you have your own opinions about, whether or not you want fat. I will say fat is necessary for your liver to be functional. It is insulating. It's protective. It has excellent functions that you need body fat. If your body fat gets too low, you will die. So you need body fat. And so by promoting excess fatty acid release, you actually start to make your body very vulnerable. And then, even if you are eating properly and getting enough calorie intake, your body won't recognize that glucose intake, and so it's going to break down your glands, your organs, your muscles to stimulate glucose formation. And then the sex hormones. So the sex hormones are in the inner zone, and these are androgens. So generally speaking, we're just call them androgens, and then they're converted to female hormones in the skin, liver, and adipose tissues. So mostly male, and then they can be converted to those female hormones, which is why you still see some low levels. Typically, it's very common to see low levels of both testosterone and estrogen in males and females. But depending on what actual reproductive organs you have, your gonads, testes will make even more testosterone, ovaries will make even more estrogen, and that then determines your secondary sexual characteristics. Hormones supplement that was released by the gonads, as I was just saying, to stimulate early development of the reproductive organs. Disorders from the cortex, things like Addison's disease, hyposecretion of those glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids, so not enough, and Cushing syndrome, which is a hypersecretion, so an oversecretion of them. There's your nice chart, kind of comparing all those hormones. Let's look at the pancreas. So the pancreas secretes hormones as an endocrine gland and digestive juice as an exocrine gland. So it's one of those that has multiple functions, dual functions here. It's going to be working both endocrine to maintain blood glucose levels, but then it has all of its digestive juices, all those enzymes that we'll look at when we get to the digestive system. The endocrine regions of the pancreas are the pancreatic islets. These are just islets are just like little groups of cells, little, islands, if you want to, of cells. There are alpha cells and beta cells. Alpha cells secrete glucagon. Beta cells secrete insulin. Okay, so alpha cells from the pancreas secrete glucagon. This increases blood glucose. Beta cells secrete insulin, which decrease blood glucose. Here's just the structure of the pancreas, kind of showing there's that duct into the small intestine, and then these are your islets with your alpha and beta cells. Glucagon, like I said, increases the blood levels of glucose, stimulating blood breakdown of glycogen and the production of glucose by the liver. So if you aren't eating enough glucose, if you're, my aunt has done Atkins for years, and so she does not typically get a sufficient amount of carbohydrates from her diet. So her body breaks down, or that's the theory, is that her body is going to be breaking down glycogen and stored um, glucose to then be able to uh, increase blood glucose levels. Negative feedback control, just like a lot of other things. Insulin is going to decrease the blood levels of glucose. It's going to cause the formation of glycogen, which is how our body stores glucose. Facilitate diffusion of glucose into cells so that it can be used. Increase protein synthesis, and convert glucose storage to fat storage. Negative feedback control, just like you would think. And again, both of these are kind of released in small amounts pretty consistently to try and maintain a stable blood glucose concentration. There's just a nice little graphic so you can see after a meal, after it's been digested, your blood glucose increases. So the islets increase insulin, decrease glucagon, and maintain homeostasis. And then opposite for between meals. So this is diabetes mellitus then. So as we said, mellitus is your sugar condition versus insipidus, which is water. So diabetes mellitus, there are two types of them. It's due either to a lack of insulin or the inability of cells to recognize insulin. This causes disturbances and disruption in how your body can metabolize carbs, fats, proteins. High blood glucose also has, it literally starts to make your blood a little bit thicker, right? And think about the structure of glucose, it can be kind of sharp. And so it can harm your eyes, heart, kidneys, peripheral nerves. If you know someone that has diabetes, you know that it's very much a disease that has to be managed, has to be monitored, because it can be fatal. So type 1 diabetes mellitus, this is an autoimmune disorder where beta cells are destroyed, so insulin production stops. They have to take insulin injections to supplement their body's lack of insulin production. Type 2 diabetes, this is when it's produced but is not recognized by cells. So we call it non-insulin dependent, meaning that, the insulin's there, that's not a problem. Your cells just are not recognizing it. They're not going to, be susceptible to its effects because they do not have receptors for it. All right, let's look at the pineal gland then. Pineal, thymus, and other endocrine tissues and organs. We're almost there, just a few more slides. All right, so the pineal gland, this is located in the posterior part of the diencephalon in the brain. It secretes melatonin to help maintain circadian rhythms, so your sense of day and night, and that idea that you are probably going to be, as humans, we are typically awake during the daylight hours, and then we go to sleep at night. And if you're somebody that starts to shift that off, you can get off of your normal body rhythm, and your body doesn't quite secrete melatonin properly. A lot of people do supplement their melatonin intake, which you can do, but definitely be careful if you give this to children, and if you take this in too high of amounts. Be careful what other prescription meds, non-prescription meds, vitamins, supplements that you take with melatonin, because it can be deadly, especially, like I said, for children. They have those little melatonin gummies, and they probably taste good, and they look like candy, so be careful with that. The thymus gland, this is between the lungs, sitting in between the heart and the sternum. It secretes thymosins that affect production differentiation of lymphocytes, important for immunity. This is where the thymus is where your T cells, your T lymphocytes that we'll study, that's where they're matured at. It's largest in children when we're most actively producing our immune cells, and then it starts to shrink as we age and just kind of regresses into connective tissue. And then a few more. Things like your reproductive organs. The ovaries produce and release estrogen and progesterone. The placenta, it also releases estrogen, progesterone, and gonadotropin. Testes producing testosterone. Your digestive organs secrete hormones associated with the stomach, small intestine, things like gastrin and ghrelin and all the different other kinds that help to regulate your appetite and the movement of material through the GI tract. Fat cells and adipose tissue, they secrete leptin that helps to regulate food intake, energy balance, and your appetite. Leptin kind of competes with ghrelin from the stomach to kind of determine if you're hungry or not. Your heart secretes this ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. That's also going to kind of work with things like aldosterone and ADH to help regulate fluid balance and blood pressure. That's really what it's trying to regulate is blood pressure, but it does so through water balance. And then your kidneys, we've seen a couple of things that they do or they're involved in, but they also secrete erythropoietin for blood cell production. The kidneys are monitoring oxygen consumption and oxygen levels, and so as those get low, they increase blood cell production, red blood cell production, specifically to increase oxygen levels. This is what athletes will dope with. So when you see like if you remember Lance Armstrong, right? That was what he was using was EPO, erythropoietin. It's a very common blood doping agent for athletes because they can take injections of it. It increases their red blood cell production, and by doing that, it gives them overall more energy. So one thing that we like to talk about when we talk about the endocrine system, especially since we cover epinephrine and cortisol, is the stress response. So factors that serve as stressors to the body can threaten homeostasis, whether those are physical or psychological stressors. Our body, it does not know the difference between you being chased by a lion or hit by a car or an exam that you have next week. To our body, those are all stressors. And so it's kind of up to us to make sure that we're getting perspective, that we're regulating it, and that we're recognizing when we're going into a stress response. Physical stress, survival of tissues, extreme cold, prolonged exercise, psychological stress, feelings of anger, depression, fear, even pleasant stimuli can cause stress. And there is good stress, right? There is a good amount of stress that we need to have, good pressure, good expectations, but it's when that stuff starts to become unregulated that we have to watch out. Oh, slipped. So there are two sets of reactions, the stress response and the general adaptation syndrome. I'm sorry. I thought that sounded weird. So the response is a set of reactions. It's called either the stress response or the general adaptation syndrome. The stages are the alarm and resistance stages. The alarm stage is that immediate fight or flight response. Let's say you're about to step out in front of a car and then you see it coming and you jump back. Your heart is pounding, your eyes are big, you're looking all over the place, you're breathing really deeply. That's your fight or flight. Your body is ready to react as fast as it can. And so that's a lot of times from the sympathetic nervous system. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are being released. It gives you increased access to energy through blood glucose, heart rate and breathing rate, blood pressure, so that way you can make sure that your organs have the blood that they need, dilating air passages for oxygen intake, carbon dioxide output, and more blood to the skeletal muscles. It's also why sometimes your skin goes pale when you get scared, because it's actually pulling blood from the skin and sending it to your muscles. Longer lasting stage is the resistance stage, and this is when cortisol starts to get active. So the stage of resistance is usually just a couple of seconds to a couple of minutes. After, once it starts to get into the couple of hours or weeks, months long stress responses, that's when cortisol is going to be taking over. Cortisol increases protein breakdown, and then gives you more amino acids. But it's increasing blood protein synthesis. It is causing fatty acids to be released rather than stored, and glucose formation, rather than using the glucose that the body is taking. It can be very, very harmful. Long-term stress is deadly. It can start to lead towards the decrease in lymphocytes, which lowers your resistance to infections, increased risk of high blood pressure, atherosclerosis, GI ulcers, as well as organ failure. It can start to shut down your organs if stress gets to be too high of levels for too long. And again, we're just talking, months here of really extensive stress without any kind of regulation can be very life-threatening. So here is both the neural and hormonal reactions to stress. You can see sympathetic impulses will both release norepinephrine directly from the nerves, but also stimulate it from the adrenal medulla for the short-term fight or flight. And then long-term, this cortisol release. So comparing these two, so that way you kind of understand and hopefully can see the difference where fight or flight is doing very visceral things to help you immediately. And this long-term adjustment, this resistance stage, it's really about the body just kind of fighting to hold on. All right, I think that's where we end, and that's a very kind of frustrating place to end, or maybe not, most helpful place to live on or end on. But you can learn to regulate your stress. Things like breathing, finding better perspective, having a grounding, meditating practice. That way, you don't sit and dwell on things that were or things that will be. Can all be very helpful. And if you need more help, reach out to me or the counseling center to talk to somebody. All right, thank you so much.